That's right. So, viewers, we have a real stalwart of gas hydrate research with us today. It's a true pleasure to have with us Dr. Tim Collett. Dr. Collett, thank you so much for
Sure.
taking time out of your busy schedule to sit down and have a chat with us. And we are beyond delighted to have you at ICGH10. To
Yeah.
start off, Dr. Collett, could you please give a brief introduction about yourself to our readers and to our listeners?
Sure. Name is Tim Collett. I'm a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. So that's part of the U.S. government in the United States, where we do geologic research on everything from gas hydrates, in this case, to conventional oil and gas resources, to earthquakes, volcanoes, and most natural systems, including water systems. My background, I've been with USGS for 40 years. And basically all that time working on unconventional resources, but particularly gas hydrates. And my focus has been mainly on a number of cooperative projects of drilling and studying gas hydrates throughout the world with great opportunities. So,
thank you so much, Dr. Collett, for the introduction. So we are here in Singapore. How are you enjoying your trip to Singapore so far? How has ICGH 10 been so far?
So on the first part, I'm not unfamiliar with Singapore, but every adventure is new. That I've had the opportunity to have many expeditions in Asia for gas hydrate drilling expeditions, and it's very common for us to use Singapore as base, where we would mob and demob ships for numerous reasons, but it's always been a very positive place for those supports. I've also had the opportunity to be at the university several times, to plan one for the meeting of here ICGH10, but also to be involved in other discussions of research at the university. So I always enjoy my time in Singapore, and it takes me back to many events throughout my life. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Collett. So one question that I'm really enjoying asking all the people I'm interviewing so far is, how did you get into the field of hydrates? Because
sure,
back when you must have started, it would have been a very, very niche area, to say the least, right?
Yeah.
And what was your first point of contact with
my first point of contact was back in 1981 with a master's thesis I completed in 1983 at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I was introduced to hydrates by a permafrost researcher named Tom Osterkamp, but was quite famous in his era of looking at permafrost engineering problems. But they were having problems in interpreting permafrost because they were seeing features related to gas hydrates what appeared very permafrost-like. So they were having a difficult time separating those. At that time, very little was known about hydrates. The only publications were in Russian, particularly who became a friend later, Yuri Makagan.
Yeah.
Yuri and myself and Keith Kronvolden at the USGS, when I moved on to USGS to work with Keith, was another quite famous name in gas hydrates, had the opportunity to meet Yuri in about 1984. Yuri Makagan had worked in West Siberian hydrates, particularly in the Meziaki field, what we became very familiar with later through other colleagues. But Yuri, first time he came to the U.S. was when, Keith and I was able to invite him and come to the U.S. in 1985 or so, and we had a long relationship. It's disappointing to know that he only passed away 2 years ago, but a long, very productive life that we really enjoyed. So as we move forward, my history in hydrate research has largely dealt with field projects. So I've had numerous colleagues along that pathway, starting from mainly in the Arctic environments of studying hydrates as a continuation of my work with Tom and others at the University of Alaska, and then continuing to the marine environments much more in the last 20 years.
It's quite funny because I remember the first paper I ever read on gas hydrates was Makagon and Makagon from 2008.
Taras, and I was a graduate student with Taras when he was at Colorado.
And then the second one I ever read was Boswell and Collett, Energy and Environmental Science. So these are all the names that you first read when starting into gas hydrate research. Yeah. So I think you already covered the focus of your work on gas hydrates. So I'm going to just ask you, how do you think gas hydrates or the research into gas hydrates has evolved over the last 20 to 30 years?
Well, I think the most important, when you spanned all the way from early 80s through the 90s and then finally the 2000s, is that there's been different kind of evolutionary periods. And with the first gas hydrate expeditions only being in 1995, of the ocean drilling program on Blake Ridge on the eastern margin of the United States, you really think of a very new science, relatively speaking. You don't think of many things where were only theorized, to exist in nature by Urey in 1965, and then only the first hydrate cores recovered in the 1980. First dedicated coring projects and studies of hydrates in 1995, and since then, you almost have like almost a Renaissance approach to it. That you had a period of very little was known about hydrates, mainly theory and conjecture, then to a period of drilling expeditions were built upon themselves, both for the Arctic and permafrost environment. So I think the most important development has been knowledge. It's basically in a generalist sense of the different expeditions giving us true sights into hydrates. And along the ways, there's been very distinct milestones where we've either confirmed thoughts or found out things were not correct and went in different directions. And I'm sure the future will bring very similar patterns to that.
So we are at ICGH10. Could you tell us the first ICGH that you ever attended? And
it's very interesting because you also have, Denny Sloan from Colorado School of Mines. Professor Sloan has been, very known by the hydrate community, and he's actually one of my major professors at one time when I graduated my own PhD from Colorado School of Mines. And Dendy and I actually went back to school later. When I graduated in '83 in Alaska, I went to work for the USGS at 23. I didn't go back for my PhD until I was 30, and it took me 8 years because I had family and other responsibilities. And that was at School of Mines. So when I look at it overall, that evolution of that period of time, but particularly the addition of the drilling expeditions and all the insight when we come to a meeting like this every 3 years, and disappointingly it's been 6 years now, and that we see a really updating of the entire community, learning from each other, seeing what we have learned through those times. And it's always been a very open forum. I've been to every ICGH, and Dendy, as I was alluding to, was Dendy and I were one of the original 5 proponents of ICGH series. So we actually proposed it originally to the New York Academy of Science is what we worked with at the first meetings. But had, I think, about 80 people at it. So it's changed a little bit through time. So
that's fantastic. I mean, from 80 to, I don't know, we are at 500 plus.
Right. And we've seen numbers in the 800s and 900s, and it varies by depending on a number of external influences. We have many of them now. So
I would not be wrong in saying that you are the foremost proponent in international gas hydrate drilling and exploration programs in the world. And you've been at several and led several programs, such programs around the world. So could you give us an idea of what a gas hydrate scientific drilling and exploration program entails?
Yeah, I think it's really evolved with time. In each of our expeditions, we're a point of time of our understanding. And one of the most critical aspects of any project, but let alone a gas hydrate expedition, is planning and what we would call the kind of the site review and preparation. If you do not do proper science up front in your planning, taking into account all new ideals and concepts, but more importantly even is understanding individual sites. Much like industry looks at prospecting, characterizing a site before investing money, what we're really doing with a drilling program. We put a great deal of effort and responsibility to anyone who's advancing a gas hydrate research program to drilling to really have done their homework about the site, because every site is very valuable, both financially and also professionally in the sense of gaining knowledge. So what I would really say some of the most important aspects of a gas hydrate expedition is all the things before you go to the field. And that's not often appreciated, is the planning aspects, the insight which you gain from your colleagues, the evaluation of the site itself, making sure the selection of all the equipment, and personnel. And what's the most important aspect of any of these efforts is the people. I've been very fortunate to have many groups what I've used and been able to work with repeatedly on a number of expeditions. And they bring their unique skill sets, what also evolved through time. But also often my position of more managing some of these, not necessarily the science component, is having the term trust, but reliance on individuals to see their project through from their components. But the most important two other factors, what's probably important, is really trying to engage in many of these areas, new young scientists. And what has happened in many places we've worked, we often are asked to partner in a sense because of our background. But many of these places, they do not have as complete of a research history in gas hydrates. So we've always made very important efforts of having dedicated positions on the ship, dedicated younger scientists, emerging science interest, because the only way we've seen national level programs really exceed is the ability to actually have a fundamental scientific base develop in hydrate research. And academics do this much better than industrial groups. Industrial groups will often change their focus through time. Academics, when they get a passion for a science, and others, their commitment is very different and long term. So each expedition and the ability to really integrate what are people with great passion, experience of all age categories to see the whole field to move ahead effectively. And the last one is very unique. I work for a fully public organization. We don't have proprietary data. So our publications have been key, to these. I personally have, and it's not bragging, but over 300 technical publications, 5 books and another 5 treatises. And because of all those issues, but when you look at those are large partnership efforts where we've published with a lot of scientists, everywhere from a very young scientist publishing their first papers to very senior scientists. So the aspect of planning, operation, and mainly people around that in the publication of really making sure that we advance, everything in our understanding of science we're most proud of.
And you say that all these publications are open to everybody to read, right?
Yeah.
So we all know that we can access any of the work that Prof. Collett has done. It's always
right. And between our own websites where we keep many of our own expedition results, we also, through the ocean drilling programs and the integrated ocean drilling programs where they have their full volumes reported, but also we've done over 8 special volumes of the Journal of Marine Petroleum Geology, dedicated to numerous expeditions. Most recently, American Association of Petroleum Geologists with a 2-edition set for the Gulf of Mexico drilling. So even all of our projects in India, the last India volume was over 46 papers altogether. For that volume of 450 journal pages of that publication, is one of the highest referenced journals in JMPG history. So we're always very proud of the impact what those papers have had, both individually for the people who contributed, but also to the community. So
Dr. Collett, how do you think the various deposits of gas hydrates around the world vary? What's the where does the diversity lie in terms of the deposits themselves? What separates, let's say, the Gulf of Mexico from KG Basin in India or from the Ankite Trough?
Yeah, there's multiple parts to that answer. One of the first answers is there's subtle similarities to all of them.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what's really important to keep in mind, that information gained from a Gulf of Mexico accumulation going to the Krishna Godavari or the North Slope of the South China Sea with my colleague Shuiyu Wang, who's here, and others, there's similarities, but then there's significant variations. And also it's important to understand that each one of these projects, we have had a strong geoscience focus, what has been applied to energy issues. But our fundamental belief is that all of our projects have focused mainly on geologic controls and understanding where the hydrates occur and why and how much, and also their stability through time. And those are the fundamental factors. When we study hydrates, there's kind of 3 main areas. There hazards issue of drilling through hydrates, producing through hydrate, slope stability, then issues of climate, environmental issues, and then also components of energy. But we find that the base science, what I just described, of understand the geologic system, the geologic controls, is the same research you do for all 3 of those topics.
I see.
And I will argue most of our work we have done has been application of the same information to these different motivations, such as energy, such as environmental. So when we look at each one of these areas or each one of the studies we conducted, there's a lot of similarities. Now, after that, we can start talking about differences between those. And most of us, when we look at energy, we're looking at a very small part of the entire hydrate types of occurrences. We're looking at highly concentrated hydrates now in sand reservoirs, not necessarily seeps and vents or fracture-dominated hydrates. They're all important, for multiple reasons. But if I'm studying, for example, environmental issues or climate issues, I might be most interested in hydrates near the seafloor. When I'm studying resources, I'm often looking at the base of the stability field in sand reservoirs. So very different kind of motivations, but the same research applies to both in the approaches you do for data. So it's particularly interesting. The Gulf of Mexico represents a unique setting of mini basins and salt tectonics and geothermal and microbial gas sources. South China Sea is very interesting in the projects we've been able to participate in. Support roles of publications have been important because of the structure 2 hydrate and free gas hydrate mixed systems. And then with India, a purely microbial system with very large gas hydrate accumulations, very complex depositional systems, what we didn't understand for years, and really marked kind of some of our evolution of thinking of hydrates. And that's without saying about the Arctic, what's the place we always return to as one of our fundamental research areas. So we kind of cycle back through quite often.
So NGHP2 reported some excellent gas hydrate deposits with high recovery, energy recovery potential, right?
Potential, yeah. We don't know. Recovery is always an interesting term, but they are very large hydrate accumulations, but also indicated a number of potential accumulations what are similar in nature throughout the setting.
So, if I may ask your impassioned view on this, what's stopping a third gas hydrate program in India or a potential field test?
Well, most of it, there's always external issues. When you look at gas hydrates don't exist as an energy resource on their own. They compete virtually with all other resources. So when you look at the world right now in a more holistic view, as you look in the U.S., since year 2005, 2006, where gas hydrate production was kind of considered expected from places like the North Slope of Alaska, but shale gas changed the field. So anytime when you think of an unconventional resource as an energy issue, you have to look at the motivation. And the motivation in most of the world, someone's got to make money from it. So when we look at, particularly the U.S. and shale gas, it really reduced the challenges or the desires to produce hydrates in many settings. When I move across the world to, regions of the world like India, what's both, one of the most positive aspects for hydrates is the demand. They have largely imported a significant amount of their resources, over 60%. Their consumption of energy is quickly increasing and growing, much more rapid than most countries. And you're seeing also then with the discoveries of hydrates under the NGHP02 in particular, you see that synergy of those two events. But all these two require periods of time to develop the opportunities. Truthfully, I think things like COVID created some disruptions in our thinking of the linearity of this, but also there's still strong interest in the Christian Godavari Basin. They're in a period of significant development of conventional resources by a partnership, by Reliance and BP and also ONGC on its own. I think those are all very good signs because they're moving into the same geologic setting, water settings, where we know where the hydrates occur. So I think all of this follows a logical pathway. Truthfully, one of the main key issues that we've reached the point of moving beyond the geologic understanding of hydrates in India to understand the producibility. To understand the producibility, you don't do that alone. And the knowledge of the Alaska project in particular, many people, lack of a better term, are waiting. They want to see what the results of this one project. It won't answer everything. It will probably only answer a few questions. But you have to be very careful that when you're looking at advancing research projects to make sure you build upon the projects that exist at this time. And the Alaska project represents a likely milestone what most groups want to wait to see how it develops.
So would you maybe like to take a couple of lines to let our viewers know about the Alaska project?
Sure. Yeah. In the public domain, the most key aspect of this project has been that we've had two previous testing programs, a long 20, 30-year history of looking at geologic controls of hydrates. And the reason the North Slope of Alaska represents an ideal test site is truly because of industry activity. On the North Slope, there's over 4,000 wells that have been drilled for conventional oil and gas exploration. Many of them penetrate hydrates. Many of them include industry data that was required for the deeper reservoirs. So it's given us a ability to be able to look at the geologic controls, map the distribution of hydrates over large areas, and characterize them because of this wealth of industry, well data, seismic data, and others. It's all in the public domain. So that's a unique aspect. The next aspect of that is because of that synergy of that type of data and our insights, it's became the area of motivation for industrial drilling with the Malik project, in Canada, but what came important after that is the Mount Albert project, what built on the results of Malik, where we looked at the geologic occurrence of hydrates and coring, and finally started to move into production testing studies with groups at Malik in 2008, 2009, and the Ignik-Sakumi projects in 2011 on the North Slope, looking at hydrate testing. Literally, when you look at these areas and motivations to move from one phase to another, one of the critical issues for hydrate testing was going to areas where we had infrastructure. We had facilities, we had roads, and we could stay. Right. The Malik project, the Ignik-Sakumi projects were all drilled from ice pads. So you had a seasonal multi-month event. That's all you could say. The most recent test was being developed for the North Slope of Alaska, along with drilling of the wells that are complete, is designed to be on a gravel pad, or a pad what is accessible by roads to an airport and trucking facilities and others. That's a site more or less you could describe almost like a permanent site, right, where you could stay and do testing.
I see.
So what's the project is generally described as is an extended production test. We're hoping to conduct flow testing of simple straight depressurization, no other variables, of looking at depressurization, hopefully up to a year.
I see. Oh, and that's pure depressurization.
Right. No, we will not. In every aspect of the test, it's a scientific experiment. We're testing a shale-bounded sand reservoirs, no contact to gas or water within the structure itself. We are not looking at any other aspect other than depressurizing the well. We do have flow assurance issues in the well for heating the well and things, but none of that's going to interact with hydrate dissociation. So this program will all focus on really truthfully science and calibration of production models. Because the fundamental issue, if you understand resource evolution, you only start understanding resources after several thousand wells. And we aren't going to have that in the near term in hydrates. What you're going to have is these short experimental studies that will help calibrate production models that we can extrapolate to other areas. So this is the very first kind of step down that pathway, we would argue.
And you're hoping to start in 2023, second half of 2023?
We would hope to start in August for our flow test, yeah.
So it's almost there.
Yeah, almost there, yeah.
If I may try to take you a little further away from the exploration realm, because the gas hydrate ecosystem has evolved into a lot more than just recovery of natural gas.
Oh, most certainly, yeah.
So we have a lot of different technological applications that are also coming into the picture.
Sure.
So if you look at how the world is going towards a low carbon future and the emphasis on reducing global warming, reducing CO2 emissions, how do you see gas hydrates participating in the ongoing global energy transition?
Yeah, I would, from both a USGS vantage point and my own personal vantage point, I would not consider myself an expert. But when you look at this, we've already touched on it to some degree. Most energy issues are dealt with in a series of kind of economic control issues, but also political issues or governmental control issues and motivations. We can see parts of the world, where governmental politics, people's desires, have impacted resource decisions greatly. We've seen other areas not as so much. That demand is so great that you don't have the luxury of some of these decisions. But the most important aspect as we look at hydrates is that we have to keep in mind the research place we're still at. If we try to look at other unconventional resources that have gone before us, the key word is motivation. What is the motivation to actually produce hydrates? You have to actually offset that against any of the environmental and climate concerns. And simply put, gas hydrates is a fossil fuel. It will not be anything other than a fossil fuel. And when you look at that issue itself, is that a significant breakthroughs on gas hydrate and productivity would definitely extend the fossil age, fossil fuels. But also there's other aspects what experts would talk about, other than myself, about bridging. What is the bridge to renewable resources? Can you quickly move from oil, gas, coal world into something other than that? And everyone knows there's a transitional events associated with those, what involves both, political will, personal investment. How quickly can you change, and others? And what I would recommend any reader is to read things like, and examine things like Hubbard's curves of energy production, how different resources have replaced one another. There is a very long history of resources being replaced, in the energy realm from days of wood to coal to oil to gas. And it's very reasonable to assume that continuation of that. But to understand that, of the timing of those and a lot of the motivations are well beyond my humble knowledge and expertise. So,
I mean, it's not like flicking a switch that you wake up tomorrow and you say, okay.
No, and I would never want anyone to think you should not try. It's the concept that there has to be an appreciation of the challenges that are involved in all cases. And many people, when they talk about gas hydrates, and particularly if you start looking at the industry interest, truthfully what's required to break a certain point of that producibility, the governments won't do that, is that companies will involve to grow their interests. You actually have to have the motivation that they expect, for the groups what they're interested in, supporting them, of having a return and interest to them.
So, Dr. Collett, what do you think is the future outlook on gas hydrates, and how do we expedite the commercialization of gas hydrate-based technological applications?
Yeah, I would never use expedite, but I say along the continuation of our understanding is that I think what's very important, as I've already indicated, the scientific requirements, at the scale what we're doing for things like for the test on the North Slope. That helps us calibrate models. It helps us predict the future. But those are very small incremental steps, what we've seen over the last 15 years when you think of testing. So one of the critical components that we do believe that there needs to be at some time parallel efforts at demonstration. If you think of like our colleagues in China, they're definitely looking at rates of production relative to well configurations. So when we see the future, I think that is an example of following a track where you're going to look at ways of motivating or stimulating hydrate production to increase rates. Right now, that's counterintuitive that many of those would actually be a distraction to us because we're trying to understand simple things like heat exchange. Energy exchange in the reservoir, how fluids migrate during production. If we added it with complexities of more complex systems, it gets difficult to interpret. So there's a science-driven approach, what I think is very important that most of our groups have really led. And then there's a demonstration type of approach. So if you look at the emergence of shale gas, it was the break from science to demonstration, where people started to apply sequences of existing technology to actually effectively produce shale gas. So what I would see is a similar pathway. But again, the motivations and the timing of that are very unclear because you've brought up other variables of renewables and expectations, of many people in the world of where we're going now.
Dr. Collett, you are one of the recipients of this year's Lifetime Achievement Awards for ICGH10 for your contributions to gas hydrate research. Anything that you would like to share with our readers or our listeners in this regard?
No, other than I'm very humble and appreciate the opportunity. I've seen many of my colleagues, go before, and many of the colleagues I work with today are as deserving or were as deserving when they did receive the award. When I look at it overall, I just will comment, what most people say. In myself, I'd like to say with sincerity, it's mostly the people I've worked with. I've always put a major focus on collaborative efforts, partnerships. And within those, the people I've worked with have been the key components. I would describe most all of my research colleagues being some of my best personal friends throughout my entire life. So when I look at it and really think about these relationships, the ability to work with others and the ability to give ideals, not to have total ownership of things, to be able to think databases, what you think are very important to you, but your ability to share those, it always comes back orders of magnitude greater in partnership relationships. So when we get bogged down in the sciences is when we're unwilling to cooperate. That's in all of our most successful projects. When you look at the projects now, like the North Slope of Alaska, JOGMEC and Department of Energy and the USGS, everything is virtually in the public domain. We're very proud of that. And there may be a little delays while we're working through results as any scientific group, but all these projects have had strong national interests, strong, significant investments, but they're in the public domain. That's great. And they're same for our colleagues in India and others. Those are major commitments to be able to do that much of an expenditure in capital and continuing on to make it available to the world. Yeah.
So, what are your upcoming plans for your future research? What do the next few years look like for Dr. Collett?
Production testing in Alaska in 2 weeks, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, and hopefully seeing India come back and everywhere else. I don't see life changing too much in the future.
Exciting times ahead then.
Yeah.
How do we get more young researchers interested in the field of hydrates? You already touched upon it a little bit with the positioning of researchers on ships and on programs.
Yeah, and those are very specific examples of things you can do to motivate. I'm an adjunct professor at Colorado School of Mines. I started again back after 5 years of only the last 5 years, and over 10 years of being kind of out of the university systems. And I have to admit that being in that environment is one of the more positive days, every Wednesday, so to speak, for me and others. So I see those stimulation. Nowadays, I grew up in the era of no computers. They didn't exist when I was young, and others all the way through a very early part of my career. When I look at a young scientist now, their comfort level with technology is extraordinary. This is actually an example of that. So, and I always really appreciate that contribution. What I think when we look at the future as we're moving forward is that many people are making career decisions. And I think when we look at any science issues, we look at hydrates and others, that I would strongly recommend talented, skilled people to move into the hydrate field and work in hydrates, but at the same time, to make sure the skill sets they're developing with that experience is transferable. Because I think most of us now who sees the future from the past, you won't work in the same fields for your entire career any longer. But the same skill sets, which you develop, everything from database handling to data interpretation to acquisition and technology, all those aspects, what are uniform to many fields of science, many fields of engineering, are the same. So, but the days of someone like myself to go through college and then to continue on to industry. I've worked for one employee for 40 years now. That's not standard. That's not normal. It wasn't even normal for mine. I think nowadays is the comfort level of being happy. And I think right now also there's a difference, is that I've seen where the expectations in your 20s and others to have your life all worked out and everything's planned has gone well into its 30s, if not beyond. And I don't see a problem with that. I've seen many people be very happy with major changes. Yeah.
So we are almost at the end of the interview.
Sure.
So just before you leave, any departing thoughts, any words of wisdom for young and upcoming gas hydrate researchers?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is one, what is always kind of a pet concern, is that know the literature, know what has become before you. And it is remarkable. I mean, a person writing their PhD thesis really doesn't understand sometimes why they're doing it. And just understanding what's come before. It's amazing when you search the literature, particularly pre-Google era literature. There's amazing discoveries that have already been made to build upon. And a lot of times people think, and very rare I find that I've made a determination or a discovery what's unique. They always have at least some foundation somewhere else. So know the literature. Right. The other thing I've already alluded to is partnerships. And and making sure you work with your colleagues at all levels, all the way from junior colleagues to your true collaborators at the time, and more senior individuals, and providing value from all those groups. Yeah, and I think the last thing is the willing to give of yourself. One thing what you find as a scientist is you older, you have a tendency to think you own ideals. Right. That this is so important, I can't tell anyone. And so what's really important is the ability to communicate, to present your ideals, to defend it, and also to really put forth new concepts and others. And the confidence to do that doesn't mean you aren't going to be, quote, shot down, and those don't matter. We were talking earlier today, some of the important aspects of the ability to handle failure is very important. And I find, with particularly our programs, our biggest changes, in our thinking and the biggest advancements came after failures instead of successes. So I think be familiar with, again, what has come before you, exchange ideals and concepts freely, but also the ability to communicate and defend those and move those forward as ideals, And I think it's always good to be on the positive side of arguments and discussions. There's no reason to be confrontational, so.
Sometimes we tend to be too defensive about our ideas.
As we know, there's certain groups of the world that to make someone else look bad is often a positive thing. It's not, but in the long run. And inability is, most people, when they think about these different issues, is that they often think that that aggression is better than partnerships, and going your own is better than partnerships. And in some of our educational systems where you read a paper in university to try to figure out what's wrong with the paper instead of what's right is not a real, it's important, but it's not a productive process. And I've seen people who have been permanently impacted by what's wrong, and it's funny. And it's good. That's how you advance understanding, by its critical evaluation. But at the same time, there's a lot of good things too. So it's trying to balance those and not take your next paper as a rebuke of someone else's work, but advancing that work in some way. So, yeah.
And with that, we've come to the end of this particular interview. I hope you all enjoyed that the wealth of information that Dr. Collett has shared with us. So, Dr. Collett, thank you so much.
Thank you
once again for doing this.
Sure.
It's an absolute pleasure. And enjoy the rest of your day.
I'll give you a traditional. Very good. Thank you. It was very good. Yeah.